What if the monster was never the monster at all? Picture this. Somewhere beneath the sun-bleached stones of ancient Crete, in a darkness so complete that even torchlight would be swallowed whole, something breathes. It does not roar, it does not rage. It simply waits, day after day, year after year, in corridors that twist back on themselves like the thoughts of a guilty king. It was placed there not because it was dangerous, but because it was shameful, not because it was evil, but because its very existence was an inconvenience to the powerful. We have told the story of the Minotaur for over 3,000 years, and almost every single time, we have told it wrong. We remember the hero, we remember the thread and the sword and the triumph, but we have never stopped long enough to ask the question that changes everything. What was it like to be the creature in the dark? What was it like to be born into a world that had already decided what you were before you ever had a chance to prove otherwise? Tonight, we are going to go down into the labyrinth, not as heroes, not as conquerors. We are going down as witnesses, and what we find there may disturb you far more than any monster ever could. Welcome back. If you are new here, I'm so glad you found this channel, because this is exactly the kind of story we live for. The myths that go deeper than the surface. The legends that crack open and reveal something uncomfortably human inside. Before we go any further, if this kind of storytelling speaks to you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel grow, and it means more stories like this one will find their way to people who are ready to hear them. Now let us descend. To understand the Minotaur, you have to understand the world he was born into, and that world was Crete, at the height of what we now call the Minoan civilization, one of the most sophisticated and enigmatic cultures the ancient Mediterranean ever produced. These were not primitive people huddled around fires. They built palaces with running water. They painted their walls with dolphins and acrobats. They traded across the sea with Egypt and the Levant. They were, by almost any measure, extraordinary. And yet, even in extraordinary civilizations, there are kings. And kings, as history has proven endlessly, have a particular talent for making decisions that ruin the lives of everyone around them. The king was Minos. And the story begins, as so many tragedies do, with a moment of pride. The god Poseidon, lord of the deep sea and the shaking earth, had given Minos a gift, a bull of impossible beauty. White as sea foam with eyes like polished obsidian, the gift came with an understanding, a divine expectation. The bull was to be sacrificed back to the god. It was a transaction, a covenant between mortal and divine. Minos was supposed to return what was given. He did not. He looked at that bull and decided it was too magnificent to kill. He kept it. He substituted an inferior animal for the sacrifice and thought, perhaps that the gods would not notice, or perhaps he simply did not care. This is the first sin of the Minotaur's story, and it belongs entirely to Minos. Poseidon noticed. The punishment was not fire. It was not flood. It was something far more intimate and far more cruel. The god turned his anger not toward Minos, but toward Minos' wife, Pasiphae. He made her fall into a consuming, unnatural desire for the very bull that her husband had refused to sacrifice. This is the part of the myth that most retellings rush past, embarrassed by its strangeness. But we should not rush past it, because it is the hinge on which everything turns. Pasiphae was not a fool. She was, in fact, a daughter of Helios, the sun god. She had divine blood in her veins, and she was being used as a weapon against her husband by a god who wanted to make a point. She did not choose what happened to her. She was a casualty of someone else's arrogance, someone else's broken promise, and from that collision of divine punishment and human failing, a child was born. The child had the body of a boy and the head of a bull. He was named Asterion. That is a name almost no one remembers, and that forgetting is itself a kind of violence. He was named Asterion, meaning starry one, and his mother loved him. Let that land for a moment. His mother loved him, Pasiphae, who had suffered through the entire ordeal, who understood better than anyone the circumstances of his birth, looked at this strange and impossible child, and she loved him. It was Minos who could not. Now here's where we need to pause and consider something. Because the myth of the Minotaur has multiple origin points, multiple explanations for how this creature came to exist in the imagination of ancient people. And each one of those explanations tells us something different about the fears and obsessions of the culture that produced it. The first explanation is the one we have already begun, the divine punishment interpretation. In this reading, the Minotaur is the living consequence of a king's hubris, Every culture that has ever told stories has a version of this theme. The gods give, the gods take away, and the punishment always fits the crime in ways that are deeply uncomfortable. Minos wanted to keep something beautiful that was not his to keep. So the gods gave him something that was undeniably his, undeniably part of his household and his bloodline, but that he could never display, never be proud of, never use to enhance his reputation. The Minotaur was a walking, breathing reminder of Minos' failure. That is why he had to be hidden. The second explanation is historical and archaeological, and it is perhaps the most fascinating of all. The palace at Knossos, the great Minoan palace on Crete, is real. It exists. Archaeologists have excavated it, walked its corridors, mapped its rooms, and when the first excavators began uncovering its floor plans in the early 20th century, they were genuinely disoriented. The palace is enormous, sprawling, multi-storied, with rooms that open into other rooms, corridors that turn unexpectedly, storage areas and ceremonial spaces and living quarters, all tangled together in a way that feels, to modern eyes, almost deliberately confusing. Some scholars have suggested that the myth of the labyrinth may be a cultural memory of this palace, that Greek traders and sailors who visited Crete, who saw the palace from the outside or glimpsed its interior, carried home stories of a vast, impossible maze, and at the center of that maze, the bull, because the bull was everywhere in Minoan culture. On their walls, in their rituals, in the famous sport of bull leaping, where young athletes would vault over the horns of charging bulls in what appears to have been a sacred athletic ceremony. The bull was not a monster to the Minoans. The bull was holy. So the Minotaur in this interpretation may be a misremembering. A Greek attempt to make sense of a foreign culture's sacred symbols. The bull-headed figure at the center of the great palace was not a monster. It was an icon, but filtered through the lens of a rival civilization, it became something to be feared and ultimately slain. The third explanation ventures into the territory of ritual and sacrifice. There are scholars who have pointed to the myth's insistence on human tribute, the young men and women sent from Athens to Crete as food for the Minotaur, and suggested that this may reflect a real historical practice. Not necessarily people being fed to a monster, but some form of tribute, perhaps slaves, perhaps sacrificial victims in religious ceremonies that the Athenians were required to send to the dominant Cretan civilization. The monster is, in this reading, a metaphor for political subjugation. The labyrinth is empire, and the Minotaur is the hungry, inhuman face that empires show to the people they have conquered. The fourth explanation is the one that lives in the psychology of the myth itself, and it is the one that I find most haunting. The Minotaur is what happens when a society cannot reconcile two things that exist simultaneously within it. The civilized and the wild, the human and the animal, the acceptable and the shameful. Every culture has things it cannot look at directly, things it must hide away, wall off, pretend do not exist. The labyrinth is not a building, the labyrinth is denial, and the Minotaur is whatever truth you have locked inside it. Now let us go deeper into the legends themselves, because the myth of the Minotaur is not a single story, it is a constellation of stories, and each one adds another layer to what we think we know. The most famous version comes to us primarily through Ovid and Plutarch, though the myth itself is far older, woven into the fabric of Greek storytelling long before those writers put it into the forms we now recognize. In this version, after Asterion is born, Minos consults the oracle and then commissions the greatest engineer of the ancient world, Daedalus, to build a prison. Not a dungeon, not a cage, a labyrinth, a structure so complex, so deliberately disorienting, that once you were inside it you could never find your way out. Think about that commission for a moment. Minos did not ask Daedalus to build a place to keep a dangerous animal. He asked him to build a place from which escape was impossible. That is a different kind of architecture entirely. That is not containment. That is erasure. The labyrinth was built beneath the palace at Knossos, and into it Asterion, the Minotaur, was placed, not because he had done anything wrong, not because he had harmed anyone, but because his existence was an embarrassment, because the sight of him reminded Minos of his own failure, his own broken covenant with the divine. The Minotaur was imprisoned for the crime of being born, and then came the tribute. Athens at this time was under the political dominance of Crete. The reasons vary depending on which version of the myth you follow, but the most common account tells us that Androgeus, the son of Minos, had been killed in Athens, and Minos held the city responsible. As punishment, Athens was required to send Every 9 years, a tribute of 7 young men and 7 young women. These 14 souls were placed in the labyrinth, and the Minotaur was left to find them in the dark. Now here is something that the myth almost never addresses directly, but that becomes deeply troubling once you notice it. The labyrinth was enormous. It was deliberately designed to be impossible to navigate. The 14 young Athenians were released into it, and the Minotaur, who had lived in that darkness his entire life, who knew its corridors the way you know the rooms of your own home, was their only companion. What did those encounters look like, really? We imagine a monster charging, we imagine screaming and blood and the terrible efficiency of a predator. But what if it was not like that? What if the creature who had been alone in the dark for years, who had never known anything but stone walls and silence, encountered these terrified young people and did not know what to do with them either? What if the violence, when it came, was not the violence of a hunter, but the violence of something that had been driven over years of isolation past the point of reason? We have spent 3,000 years judging the Minotaur for what happened in the labyrinth. We have never once asked what the labyrinth did to him first. This is the moment in our story where I want to invite you into the conversation, because this is exactly the kind of question that does not have one answer. I want to know what you think. Was the Minotaur a monster by nature, or was he made into one? Was there ever a version of this story where Asterion could have been something other than what he became? Leave your theory in the comments below. I read them, and some of the most fascinating interpretations I have ever encountered have come from people watching exactly this kind of video. Your perspective matters here. Now let us talk about Theseus, because we cannot tell this story honestly without examining the hero and examining him with the same critical eye we have turned on everyone else. Theseus was the son of Aegeus, the king of Athens. When the time came for the third tribute to be sent to Crete, Theseus volunteered to go. Depending on which version you follow, he was motivated by heroism, by a desire to end the tribute once and for all, or by a need to prove himself worthy of the throne. Perhaps all three. He told his father that if he succeeded, he would change the ship's sails from black to white on the return voyage, so that Aegeus would know from the shore that his son lived. In Crete, something unexpected happened. Ariadne, the daughter of Minos, saw Theseus and fell in love with him. She went to Daedalus, the architect of the labyrinth, and asked him for the secret of escape. Daedalus gave her a ball of thread. Ariadne gave the thread to Theseus. He would tie one end to the entrance and unwind it as he walked, giving himself a path back through the darkness, armed with a thread and a sword. Theseus entered the labyrinth. The battle between Theseus and the Minotaur is one of the most depicted scenes in all of ancient art. It appears on vases, on friezes, on coins, on temple walls across the Greek world, and in almost every depiction, the Minotaur is shown in the moment of defeat, kneeling, falling, already dying. The hero stands over him, triumphant. What is almost never depicted is the Minotaur's face. When artists did attempt to render his expression, when they tried to capture something of the creature's inner state in that final moment, what they produced was not rage, it was not the snarl of a beast, it was something closer to exhaustion. Something that looks, if you study those ancient images long enough, uncomfortably like relief. The Minotaur was killed in the dark, in the only home he had ever known, by a stranger following a thread, and the world celebrated. Theseus sailed back to Athens. He forgot to change the sails. His father, Aegeus, watching from the cliff, saw the black sails of morning approaching and threw himself into the sea. The hero who had gone to slay a monster returned home and, through a moment of carelessness or grief or simple forgetfulness, caused the death of his own father. The myth does not let anyone escape cleanly. Not Minos, not Daedalus, not Theseus. Everyone who touched the labyrinth was changed by it, diminished by it, haunted by it. Everyone except Ariadne, perhaps. And even she was abandoned on the island of Knossos by the hero she had saved. The labyrinth had a long reach. Now let us turn to the regional variations of this myth, because the story of the Minotaur did not exist in a single, fixed form. It shifted and changed depending on where it was told and who was telling it. In some older versions of the myth, the Minotaur is not portrayed as a mindless beast at all. He is described as possessing a kind of terrible intelligence. The labyrinth in these tellings was not just a prison for the creature, it was also a test. The young people sent from Athens were not simply prey. They were participants in something that had the structure of a ritual, a dark ceremony whose true meaning had been lost even to the people performing it. There are fragments, tantalizing and incomplete, that suggests the original Cretan myth may have been something quite different from what the Greeks made of it. In the Minoan world, the bull was a sacred animal associated with the divine, with power, with the forces of the earth itself. A figure that was part human and part bull would not have been a monster in that context. It would have been something closer to a god, or at least a divine intermediary, a being that stood between the human world and the world of the sacred. Some scholars have suggested that the original story involved not a monster to be slain, but a figure to be honored, perhaps even to be propitiated. The tribute from Athens in this reading was not a horror, but a religious offering, and the labyrinth was not a prison, but a sacred space, a place where the boundary between the human and the divine was deliberately blurred. The Greeks, who were often in competition and conflict with the older Minoan civilization, may have taken this story and inverted it. The sacred bull figure became a monster. The holy labyrinth became a prison. The religious tribute became an atrocity, and the act of killing the divine figure became heroism. This is how mythology works. The stories of the defeated are retold by the victors, and in the retelling, everything that was sacred becomes monstrous, and everything that was monstrous becomes heroic. There are also regional variations in the story of Daedalus that add another layer of darkness to the whole affair. In some versions, Daedalus did not simply build the labyrinth and hand over the secret of the thread. He was later imprisoned in his own creation by Minos, who did not want the architect to share the labyrinth's secrets with anyone else. Daedalus, the genius who had built the prison, became a prisoner himself. He escaped, famously, by building wings of wax and feathers for himself and his son Icarus. Icarus flew too close to the sun. The wax melted. He fell into the sea. The labyrinth kept claiming its victims long after the Minotaur was dead. It was as if the structure itself had a kind of hunger, a need to consume the people connected to it. Minos, who built it, lost his authority and eventually his life. Daedalus, who designed it, lost his son. Theseus, who conquered it, lost his father. Ariadne, who provided the key to it, lost her home, her family, and the man she loved. And Asterion, who never asked to be placed inside it, lost everything from the very beginning. What did the Minotaur symbolize to the ancient world? This is the question at the heart of our story, and it has more than one answer. On the surface, the most obvious interpretation is that the Minotaur represents the animal nature within humanity, the beast that lives beneath the civilized exterior. Every person contains, the myth suggests, something wild and ungovernable, something that, if not properly contained, will consume what it loves. The labyrinth is the structure of civilization itself, the laws and customs and walls we build to keep the animal nature from running free. But this interpretation, satisfying as it is, has a problem. It assumes that the animal nature is inherently dangerous, inherently something to be feared and contained. It assumes that the beast must be slain, and it places the hero, the rational, civilized, sword-bearing man who follows a thread of reason through the chaos, firmly on the side of the good. What if we resist that assumption? What if the Minotaur represents something different? Not the animal within humanity, but the part of humanity that civilization has decided it cannot accommodate, the part that does not fit, the person who is born different, who looks different, who exists in a way that makes the powerful uncomfortable. The Minotaur was not dangerous when he was born. He was simply unusual. It was his imprisonment, his isolation, his deprivation of any kind of human connection that made him what he became. The labyrinth created the monster it claimed to be containing. This is a reading of the myth that resonates across centuries and cultures because every society has its labyrinth. Every civilization has people it has decided to wall away, to hide from sight, to pretend do not exist, and every civilization has then used the suffering of those walled-away people as justification for the walls. He is dangerous, we say, he must be contained, and we never stop to ask whether the danger came before the walls or after them. There is also a political dimension to the Minotaur's symbolism that deserves attention. The tribute from Athens, those 14 young people sent every 9 years, is a picture of imperial power at its most intimate and most brutal. It is not enough for Crete to dominate Athens economically or militarily. Crete must take Athens' children, must consume the future of the subjugated city in the belly of its most shameful secret. This is what empire looks like from the inside. Not grand battles and noble conflicts, but the quiet, systematic extraction of the most precious things a people have, their young, their potential, their future, fed into a darkness that serves no purpose except to maintain the dominance of the powerful. Theseus's victory in this reading is not just personal heroism, it is liberation. The slaying of the Minotaur is the breaking of the tribute system, the end of Athens' subjugation. And yet, even here, the myth complicates things, because Theseus could not have succeeded without the help of Ariadne, a daughter of the very empire he was fighting. The liberation of Athens required the betrayal of Crete by one of Crete's own, and Theseus repaid that betrayal by abandoning the woman who had made his triumph possible. The myth gives us no clean victories. Every triumph contains within it the seeds of a new injustice. Now let us talk about the disturbing details, the things the myth mentions almost in passing and then moves away from, as if even the storytellers found them too uncomfortable to dwell on. The name, Asterion, the starry one. This was the name Pasiphae gave her son, and it is a name of beauty and wonder. It suggests that his mother saw in him not a monster but something luminous, something that deserved to be named for the stars. The contrast between that name and the fate of the creature who bore it is almost unbearable. The darkness. The labyrinth had no windows, no natural light. The Minotaur lived his entire life in artificial darkness, in a space specifically designed to be disorienting and inescapable. Modern psychology has a great deal to say about what prolonged isolation and sensory deprivation does to a mind, human or otherwise. The labyrinth was not just a prison, it was a form of slow destruction. The silence. Between the tributes, which came only every 9 years, the Minotaur was alone, completely alone, for years at a stretch. In the dark, in the maze, with nothing but the sound of his own breathing and the distant muffled sounds of the palace above him. What does 9 years of solitude do to a creature that was born with human consciousness? What does it do to anything? And then there is the question that the myth never answers, the one that haunts me most. Did the Minotaur know who he was? Did he know his name? Did he know that somewhere above him, in the sunlit palace, there was a mother who had loved him? Did he know that he had been placed in the dark not because of anything he had done, but because of something his father could not forgive? We do not know. The myth does not tell us, and that silence is its own kind of horror. There is also a deeply troubling contradiction at the heart of the Theseus story that most retellings simply ignore. Theseus is celebrated as a hero for slaying the Minotaur, but the Minotaur, as we have established, was imprisoned for the crime of being born. He was isolated, deprived, and driven to whatever violence he committed by the conditions of his imprisonment. Killing him did not address any of those conditions, it simply removed the evidence. Minos, who created the tribute system, who built the labyrinth, who imprisoned his own stepson in the dark, faced no heroic reckoning. The labyrinth still stood after Theseus left. The political structure that had subjugated Athens still existed, at least for a time. What Theseus slew was not the cause of the suffering. He slew the most visible symptom of it, and then he sailed home and forgot to change his sails. The myth is smarter than it looks. It knows that killing the monster does not solve the problem. It knows that the labyrinth outlasts the Minotaur. It knows that the real architects of tragedy, the kings and gods who set all of this in motion, walk away largely unscathed. And it encodes all of this knowledge in the details that we tend to overlook, in the forgotten name, the abandoned woman, the black sails, the father falling from the cliff. The legacy of the Minotaur in the modern world is vast and perhaps surprising. The creature has never gone away. It has simply changed its shape. In literature, the labyrinth and the Minotaur have been reimagined countless times, each reimagining reflecting the anxieties of its own era. Some writers have told the story from the Minotaur's perspective entirely, giving him a voice and an inner life, making him the protagonist of a story that was always, in some sense, his. These retellings tend to be among the most emotionally devastating. Because once you inhabit his perspective, even briefly, the familiar story becomes almost impossible to bear. The labyrinth itself has become one of the most enduring symbols in human culture. It appears in architecture, in art, in psychology, in mathematics. The word labyrinthine has entered the language as a way of describing anything that is deliberately complex, confusing, and difficult to escape. We use it to describe bureaucracies and legal systems and the architecture of power. We use it without always realizing it to describe the structures that trap people who have done nothing wrong. The bull-headed figure has appeared in cultures far beyond ancient Greece. Bull imagery, bull worship, the sacred power of the bovine form, these things appear in Egypt, in Mesopotamia, in the Indus Valley, In the ancient Near East, the Minotaur, or something like him, haunts the edges of many mythologies. He is the thing that is both human and not human, both familiar and alien, both pitied and feared. In the study of psychology, the labyrinth has been used as a metaphor for the unconscious mind, the vast, dark, disorienting interior space where we keep the things we cannot face. And the Minotaur is what lives there. Not a monster by nature, but something that has been locked away for so long in such darkness that it has become monstrous by circumstance. The therapeutic project in this reading is not to slay the Minotaur, but to find him, to go into the labyrinth without a sword, to sit with the creature in the dark and ask it what it needs. That is a very different kind of heroism than the one Theseus performed, and it is perhaps a more honest one. The story of the Minotaur has also been read as a myth about the relationship between civilization and nature, between the ordered world of the palace and the wild, ungovernable forces that civilization depends on but cannot fully control. The bull is the earth's power. The labyrinth is the attempt to contain that power, and the attempt, as always, is only partially successful. You can build walls around the wild, you cannot make it disappear. As we come to the end of our time in the labyrinth, I want to leave you with the image that I think captures the whole myth most completely. Not the battle. Not the hero standing triumphant over the fallen creature. Not the thread leading back to the light. I want you to picture the moment before any of that. A child, strange and impossible, born into a world that does not know what to do with him. His mother holds him and gives him a name that means starry one. For a brief time, he is simply a child. He does not know yet what he is. He does not know yet what the world has decided to do with him. And then the walls go up. The labyrinth is built not to protect anyone from the Minotaur. The labyrinth is built to protect the king from having to look at what his pride cost. The darkness descends not because the creature is dangerous, but because the creature is inconvenient. And in the darkness, over years and years of silence and isolation and the occasional terrible encounter with terrified strangers, whatever might have been, whatever Asterion, the starry one, might have become in a different world, is slowly unmade. The monster is not what was born. The monster is what the labyrinth created, and the labyrinth was built by human hands, commissioned by human shame, and maintained by human willingness to look away. This is the myth's deepest and most enduring truth. The things we lock in the dark do not disappear. They grow. They change. They become exactly what we feared they were, not because that was their nature, but because we gave them no other option. The labyrinth is always already within us, and we are always already building it around something that deserves better. The Minotaur was never the monster of this story. He was its most tragic victim, and the hero who slew him in the dark and sailed home on black sails was celebrated, while the architect of the prison walked free, and the king who ordered it all lived on in his sunlit palace above the darkness he had created. We have been telling this story for 3,000 years. Maybe it is time we told it differently. Now I want to hear from you, and I mean that genuinely. Which part of this story stayed with you? Do you see the Minotaur as a victim, or do you think the myth is more complicated than that? And here is the bigger question. Which creature, which myth, which legend should we descend into next? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Tell me the story you want to hear told this way, the one that has always felt like it had more inside it than anyone has bothered to look for. I read every single comment, and your suggestions have shaped some of the best stories on this channel. If this journey through the labyrinth meant something to you, please like this video and subscribe so you never miss the next one. These stories take time and care to build, and every like, every subscription, every shared video is what makes it possible to keep going deeper. We have so many more myths waiting in the dark, so many more creatures whose stories have been told wrong, whose true nature is stranger and more human than anyone has admitted. The labyrinth is vast, and we have only just begun to explore it.